My cousin stole a watch that belonged to me and sold it behind my family's back. My grandfather, Marvin Elwood, was a quiet man with careful hands. He owned a modest watch repair shop in a small town in Missouri for nearly 50 years, the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked driving past it. But inside that workshop, he created something extraordinary, a handcrafted pocket watch that he poured his heart into over the course of 3 years. It was made from brushed gold, with delicate engravings and a movement designed entirely from scratch. That watch, in both craftsmanship and history, was unlike anything else in our family, or town. From the time I was 10, Grandpa Marvin talked about the watch like it was an heirloom in waiting. But not for just anyone. He always said it would go to the first grandchild who followed in his footsteps, not as a watchmaker necessarily, but someone who honored craftsmanship, discipline, and mechanical understanding. He saw modern engineering as the new frontier of the craft he loved, and he believed his watch should be passed down to someone who truly understood it. That person turned out to be me. My name's Calvin Merritt, and from an early age I was obsessed with how things worked. I spent hours in Grandpa Marvin's shop, asking about escapements and torque and mainsprings. Later, I went to school for mechanical engineering, worked part-time jobs to help pay tuition, and even took extra courses in micromechanics and horological design. For my senior thesis, I built a model movement inspired by Grandpa's methods and cited his notebooks, the same ones he used to design the gold pocket watch. He came to my graduation and teared up at dinner when he handed me a small box of tools from his shop. He didn't hand over the watch that night. But everyone in our family understood it was intended for me. When Grandpa Marvin passed away 5 years ago, it hit all of us hard. My parents, my aunts and uncles, and all of us cousins came together for the funeral and to help close up the house. The watch wasn't mentioned at first. We were still in the thick of grief, making arrangements, contacting distant relatives, cleaning out belongings room by room. My cousin, Delia, the only other grandchild close to Grandpa in her own way, offered to help clean out the house while I handled the memorial service details. Delia and I had grown up together, but we were very different. She was a visual artist, more drawn to aesthetic beauty than functional design. She appreciated the artistry of our grandfather's work but never took interest in its mechanical side. Still, she and Grandpa had their own connection, especially toward the end of his life. A week after the service, when things started to settle, I asked about the watch. Delia was oddly evasive. Then finally, she said, Grandpa told me shortly before he passed that he wanted me to have it. He said I had a deeper appreciation for the beauty of it, not just the gears and parts. At first, I didn't know how to respond. That wasn't what he had told me. Or the rest of the family. Or what he'd said publicly at my graduation dinner in front of 15 relatives. But I was grieving, and I didn't want to question someone else's grief or turn a period of mourning into an argument. So I let it go. Months passed, and I tried to move on. I assumed, maybe, she had misremembered. Or maybe Grandpa said something ambiguous toward the end. I didn't want to believe he'd changed his mind, but I also didn't want to be the one to stir conflict. I had no proof. The notebook where he documented the watch's construction, the one I'd seen with my own eyes, was missing. So I told myself to focus on the life he helped me build, and not the object left behind. That illusion shattered last month. I'm a member of an online horology forum where collectors, engineers, and enthusiasts share their timepieces and discoveries. One evening, while scrolling through recent posts, I froze. A collector from Michigan named Ralph W. had posted about an incredibly rare, handcrafted Elwood pocket watch, sold to me by the granddaughter of the maker. He included photos. There was no mistaking it. The watch's engraving, the family crest hidden under the case back, the double casing system Marvin invented, it was unmistakably the same one. My grandfather's watch. The one meant for me. My heart was racing. I clicked through the images and read every word. Ralph praised the innovation of the movement and said it was now the centerpiece of my collection. He even mentioned that he was planning to submit it to a small museum exhibition later this year. It was there in plain sight, sold as a collectible rather than cherished as an heirloom. I called Delia the next morning. She didn't even try to deny it. It was just sitting in a drawer, she said. At least now someone who appreciates it owns it. I reminded her that I appreciated it. That Grandpa made it for someone who understood both the art and the engineering. Her response? Well, what's done is done. If you cared that much, you should have said something sooner. That conversation ended with me shaking. I called the buyer, Ralph, to explain. I told him the watch had been promised to me by the maker himself and that the sale was not only against my grandfather's wishes, but also done without the consent of the family. Ralph was polite, but firm. He said he paid fair value, had a receipt, and wasn't interested in returning it. I bought this in good faith, he said. If there's a disagreement, it sounds like it's something for your family to work out. So I took the next step. I hired a lawyer. When I decided to take legal action, it wasn't out of spite. It wasn't even primarily about the money, though the watch had significant market value. It was about what the watch represented. To me, that piece was a physical embodiment of my grandfather's trust in me. His belief that what he'd built with his hands would live on in someone who valued not just the beauty of it, but the intricacy. Delia hadn't just violated that trust. She'd taken something meant to carry our family's legacy forward and sold it to someone outside the family, without so much as a conversation. That betrayal ran deeper than I had anticipated, and I knew I couldn't just walk away from it. After speaking with my attorney, we began gathering documentation. My goal wasn't just to try to reclaim the watch, I wanted to establish clearly and legally that it had been wrongfully taken. Even if I never got it back, I wanted to set the record straight and honor my grandfather's intent. To do that, I needed more than just my word. I reached out to other family members. My cousin Jonah, who'd often visited Grandpa Marvin in his final year, told me he remembered a very specific conversation 2 weeks before Marvin passed. In it, Grandpa had spoken about Calvin's hands and how he was proud I would carry on the craft in modern form. Jonah told me, he was clear. He said the watch was going to you. No question. I also contacted my Aunt Meredith, Marvin's eldest daughter, who confirmed she'd heard her father talk about the watch's future many times. He said it at dinner more than once, she told me. Always said it would go to the one who followed his work. That was you. These weren't vague recollections. They were consistent. And there were a lot of them. But then I found something unexpected. While reviewing old emails, I came across a thread I had forgotten, a set of messages I'd sent the week after Marvin's funeral, asking Uncle Ron, Delia's father, if he had come across the watch. His reply had been strange at the time. Delia told me she spoke to your grandfather near the end and he had changed his mind. I trust she knows what he said. That message hadn't meant much to me when I first read it, I was grieving and overwhelmed. But now it revealed something significant. Delia had manipulated not just me, but her father and perhaps others into believing a different story. I called Uncle Ron to ask about it directly. His voice on the phone was heavy. Cal, I have to apologize. I think I was misled. She told me Marvin had a change of heart. Said he spoke to her in private while you were at the hospital cafeteria and said he worried you just keep the watch locked away somewhere. That you were more interested in its mechanics than its beauty. It was hard to hear. I had never heard my grandfather suggest anything like that. But Uncle Ron, who was trying to sort through Marvin's personal effects with Delia at the time, had believed it. He hadn't meant harm, but in trusting his daughter, he handed her something that wasn't hers to give away. No one else had been present during the supposed change of heart moment. It was just Delia's word. As we compiled this evidence, my attorney, Ms. Lockhart, grew more confident in our case. Intent can be tricky, she said, but you have consistent verbal testimony from multiple relatives, and this manipulation, if we can show it, will strengthen your position significantly. We formally filed the lawsuit 3 weeks later, against both Delia and the buyer, Ralph W., whose real name we now knew to be Ralph Wisner. The filing cited wrongful appropriation of inherited property and requested either the return of the item or equivalent financial compensation based on appraisal value. That was when the fallout began. Delia went quiet for 2 days after she received notice of the lawsuit. Then, her tone changed. She posted a long message on her personal social media, indirectly referencing the situation. Imagine being so obsessed with proving you were chosen that you'd sue your own sister over a piece of metal. Some people care more about legacy than living. The comments were filled with support from her friends, people who didn't know the full story. Words like greedy and unbelievable were used, aimed at me. I ignored them at first, until mutual friends and family started reaching out, confused. Is it true you're suing Delia over something she inherited? One cousin texted. Another asked, did Grandpa really say the watch was for her? I explained where I could, but not everyone was receptive. Some people thought the whole thing should have stayed private. Others thought I was right but didn't want to get involved. And then came the hardest phone call, my mom. She didn't raise her voice. She just sounded tired. "Calvin," she said, "I understand why you're doing this. But I need to tell you something. I've been having some medical tests done. I didn't say anything earlier because I didn't want to worry anyone. But I need you to know that all of this, the fighting, the tension, it's not helping." I felt the wind go out of me. She explained that she'd been undergoing scans for a growth they found during a routine checkup. Nothing was definitive yet, but there were signs it could be serious. My father had been taking her to appointments quietly, trying not to alarm the family. And all the while, I had been deep in legal research, interviews, evidence gathering. It broke something in me. That night, I went on a long walk, thinking about what I was doing and why. I still believed I was right, that the watch belonged in our family, and that Delia had taken something she knew wasn't hers. But I began to realize that every decision from here on had consequences that went beyond me. Beyond even Delia. Still, the lawsuit couldn't simply be dropped. Too much had happened. Too many lines had been crossed. And Ralph, the buyer, wasn't interested in compromise unless it came through legal channels. Ms. Lockhart, ever the realist, told me, "We're in this now. But you do have some leverage." She was right. The judge had accepted our case, and discovery was underway. We had enough family testimony and communication history to demonstrate Marvin's intent. And perhaps, if we applied pressure in the right places, we could reach a settlement that would avoid a costly trial. Still, I had no idea what would happen next. The court date arrived on March 18th, almost 2 months after I filed the suit. I barely slept the night before. I knew we had evidence, testimony, and legal standing, but this wasn't just about a case. It was about facing my cousin in a courtroom, under oath, about a man we both loved. No part of this felt like winning. Delia arrived with her attorney, looking exhausted. She didn't glance in my direction. Her father, Uncle Ron, was with her, his face unreadable. My own parents sat behind me quietly, Mom with a scarf over her head, Dad holding her hand. It was the first time our whole family had been in the same room since Grandpa Marvin's funeral. The hearing wasn't a trial, not yet. This was preliminary, a chance for the judge to hear from both sides and determine if the case warranted full proceedings or should be mediated or dismissed. Still, it felt incredibly formal. My lawyer, Ms. Lockhart, was sharp and composed as always. She began by walking the judge through the family history. Marvin Elwood, retired horologist, created a one-of-a-kind pocket watch over 3 years. He had expressed clear verbal intent, multiple times and in front of family, to leave it to me, his grandson, Calvin Merritt, the only grandchild who pursued mechanical engineering and horological study. The watch had been removed from his home shortly after his death by Delia Merritt, who later sold it to Ralph Wisner, a private collector, without notifying the family. Then came the emails. The texts. The social media posts. Ms. Lockhart had compiled them all. Uncle Ron's old email response. Texts where Delia had acknowledged the value of the watch. Screenshots of Ralph's forum post, praising the watch as a once-in-a-lifetime acquisition with deep family significance. Ralph's attorney pushed back, of course. He claimed Ralph purchased the watch in good faith and had no way of knowing there was a dispute. But then Ms. Lockhart showed the judge the actual messages between Delia and Ralph before the sale. In those texts, Delia wrote, "My grandfather originally meant it for my cousin, but he's into digital watches now. I don't think he wants it. He never said anything after Grandpa passed, so I figured it didn't mean much to him." That wasn't just misleading, it was false. I'd emailed, texted, and asked about the watch within days of the funeral. Ms. Lockhart showed the judge those messages too. Then came testimony. First up was Uncle Ron. He spoke hesitantly but honestly. "I believed what Delia told me," he said. "That Grandpa had changed his mind. But now, hearing everything, I think I was wrong. I think she took advantage of the situation." Next was my cousin Jonah. He described the visit 2 weeks before Grandpa Marvin died, how Marvin had spoken passionately about passing the watch to me. He said it was for Calvin. No one else. Finally, Ms. Lockhart called Edwin Barlow, Grandpa's former apprentice from the shop. Edwin now runs his own watch studio in Illinois, but he had taken a day off just to testify. I remember the day Mr. Elwood showed me the finished pocket watch, Edwin said. He said he was saving it for his grandson who was studying engineering. Calvin. He wanted someone who would understand the mechanism and the meaning. His words carried weight. Edwin was the only person outside the family who had intimate knowledge of the watch's design. His testimony painted a clear picture of Marvin's intentions that had been ignored. Delia's turn came last. She looked visibly anxious as she took the stand. Her lawyer asked her to explain her side. She repeated what she had said privately, that Marvin had a private conversation with her in the hospital, saying he wasn't sure Calvin would appreciate the watch the way she would. That he had come to value artistic vision just as much as technical skill. When asked for details, she struggled. She couldn't remember what day this conversation happened. No one else had witnessed it. Her story lacked the clarity and consistency of everyone else's. Then came the moment that changed everything. During questioning, Ms. Lockhart asked, "How much did Mr. Wisner pay for the watch?" Delia looked down. $17,500. The judge leaned forward. "Could you repeat that?" $17,500, she said again. Gasps moved through the courtroom, including from Ralph himself, who looked stunned that the price had been revealed. Ms. Lockhart paused, then said, "Your Honor, the current appraisal on the watch is $456,000, due to its custom construction, documented provenance, and the late Mr. Elwood's reputation among collectors. My client is prepared to submit 3 separate appraisals confirming this." Delia's voice cracked. "I didn't know what it was worth. I just needed money quickly. We were about to lose a rental." She broke down, explaining that she and her boyfriend had invested nearly all their savings into a crypto startup that turned out to be a scam. Within weeks, they'd lost over $30,000. They were behind on rent. Credit cards were maxed. She said Ralph offered quick cash, and she accepted without doing real research. "I didn't know how valuable it was," she repeated. I panicked." Even Ralph's attorney looked uneasy. Ms. Lockhart pressed on, "Did you mention the value of the watch to Mr. Wisner?" Delia hesitated. "No. But I think he knew." The judge called a recess. During the break, I sat in silence while people whispered around me. Mom was pale. Dad had his hand on her back. Delia sat across the aisle, crying softly, her father beside her with a hand on her shoulder. When we returned, the judge requested all parties consider entering mediation before full trial proceedings. She said the conflicting testimonies and text messages suggested impropriety, and that an amicable solution would spare the family further damage. Later that day, Ralph Wisner's lawyer approached Ms. Lockhart with a settlement proposal. Ralph would return the watch in exchange for a refund of the amount he paid, $17,500, under the condition that we acknowledge in writing he was unaware of any dispute at the time of the sale. Delia would be responsible for repaying that amount over time. But there was a problem. Delia didn't have the money. She'd spent nearly all of it already. She could commit to a monthly payment plan, $500 a month, but only if I agreed to pay Ralph up front. Essentially, I'd be buying back what was already meant to be mine. My lawyer left the choice up to me. "We can push for trial. But it'll be long. Expensive. And emotionally brutal. Or, you can choose resolution." I didn't answer that day. There was too much noise in my head, disappointment, frustration, weariness. I had come seeking justice. Now I had to decide what it was actually worth. I spent the evening after the hearing alone. I drove out past the edge of town to a little overlook where Grandpa Marvin and I used to sit when I was younger. He would bring a thermos of coffee, a paper bag with sandwiches, and a few old tools just in case inspiration struck. I remember watching him sketch designs right there, using his knee as a makeshift table, murmuring things like, "Balance is everything, in gears and in life." I kept hearing that sentence over and over in my head, "Balance is everything." By the next morning, my decision was made. I would accept the settlement. It wasn't easy. It wasn't perfect. It meant paying $17,500 out of my own pocket to reclaim something that was meant for me from the beginning. But the alternative, months or even years in court, more stress on my parents, and further fracturing of the family, wasn't a burden I wanted to carry any longer. The watch would return home. That was what mattered most. Delia and I met at our lawyer's office the following Tuesday to sign the paperwork. Ralph Wisner was also present. When he handed the watch over, it was enclosed in a soft cloth wrap, not the original velvet box my grandfather kept it in, but still handled with care. As soon as I held it, my breath caught. It was the first time I'd seen it in nearly 5 years. I noticed right away that there were a few small scratches on the case, and the crown had a slight looseness to it, signs it had been handled by someone unfamiliar with vintage mechanisms. I didn't say anything. I just nodded. Ralph, to his credit, apologized. I took it to a jeweler for a cleaning. I don't think they had much experience with pieces like this. I'm sorry if it was damaged. I thanked him for returning it. After the meeting, I brought the watch to a specialist, a watchmaker in a nearby city who had trained under one of Marvin's peers. The damage wasn't major. The restoration cost me $850, but within a week, the piece was back to its original condition. When I wound it and heard that first soft tick again, it felt like something had realigned inside me. Delia, for her part, has made good on her end of the agreement so far. She's begun monthly payments to Ralph to reimburse the amount I fronted. She took on a second job working weekends at a small cafe in addition to her part-time graphic design work. She texted me last week to let me know she had submitted her second payment. Her relationship with her boyfriend is complicated. From what I've gathered, he moved out shortly after their fight about the watch but returned later, and they're trying to rebuild things slowly. They've downsized to a smaller apartment and put any engagement or house hunting plans on hold. A few weeks after the settlement, Delia called and asked to meet for coffee. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I agreed. We sat at a quiet diner neither of us had been to before. She brought a box with her. I went through all my storage, she said. And I found this. Inside the box was the notebook. Marvin's notebook. It was exactly as I remembered it, worn leather cover, pages filled with sketches, measurements, notes, and margin doodles. His handwriting, precise but warm. There were dated entries tracing each step of the pocket watch's creation, along with small personal reflections. One line caught me off guard. If Calvin reads this someday, I hope he sees the care in every tooth, every spring. I built this with him in mind, though I never told him directly. He's like a gear that won't quit, always moving forward. I didn't realize I had tears in my eyes until Delia reached across the table and handed me a napkin. I'm sorry, she said. I was so caught up in feeling like I was always in your shadow that I didn't stop to ask myself why that shadow was even there. You weren't trying to outshine anyone. You were just doing what you love. She admitted that she'd carried years of quiet resentment. That she thought Marvin favored me because I spoke his language, the language of gears and mechanisms, and she never felt like she could connect with him on the same level. When she saw the watch after he died, she said something in her snapped. She wanted to be seen, not just as an artist, but as someone worthy of the legacy too. It didn't make her actions right. But it gave me context I hadn't understood before. We've now attended 4 family counseling sessions together. The first 2 were awkward, but by the third, we started talking more openly. I told her I probably talked too much about my engineering work growing up and never noticed how isolating that might have felt. She shared that she'd often felt like the background cousin, the one who was always present but never at the center of the story. I also admitted something, that I had placed so much importance on the watch because, in many ways, it was the only tangible piece of Marvin I felt I could still hold on to. She nodded. I get that now. As for my mother, her condition, thankfully, is stable. The growths detected during her earlier tests turned out to be non-cancerous, though they'll continue to monitor them with regular checkups. She told me privately that she was proud of how I handled everything, even if it was painful to watch. We've started doing Sunday lunches again, just the 3 of us for now. Dad makes sandwiches like Marvin used to, and Mom brings out her old photo albums. We sit and talk. Not just about the past, but about how we move forward. The watch sits in a display case in my home office, not locked away, but where I can see it every day. I wind it once a week and listen to the soft, steady tick. I think Marvin would have liked that. Epilogue: What legacy really means. The final tally for everything, legal costs, appraisal fees, the restoration, and the payment to Ralph, came out to just over $99,000. It was a steep price for something that, by all rights, should have been given freely. But I don't regret any of it. Because what I got back wasn't just a watch. It was a story, about family, about legacy, about the ways we misunderstand each other even when we're trying to do the right thing. I've learned that heritage isn't just what we inherit, it's what we choose to protect. Marvin didn't build that watch for a museum, or for a collector, or even for admiration. He built it for someone who would listen to its rhythm. Someone who knew that every tick, every gear, every polished corner carried meaning. I may have paid a high price to bring it home. But I didn't lose anything. I found something. Thank you for watching the video, like it if you watched the video to the end and don't forget to subscribe. Have a nice day.